and welcome. I'm Gail Stearns, Dean of the Wallace All-Faith Chapel at Chapman University. I'm honored to be your host for today's program and to welcome you to this year's virtual Sikhlens Vaisakhi weekend celebration. In past years, the annual Sikhlens celebration has been held here at the Fish Interfaith Center on the Chapman University campus. I'm sitting in my office at Fish, where the quiet halls here just don't seem the same without your energy, presence, and the kindness you share with us. This year, due to the pandemic, the Sikhlens Vaisakhi celebration has been expanded to this virtual 3-day event, which I hope you will enjoy. Today's program includes a series of sessions which will run consecutively after our film. So please stay tuned as each session transitions into the next. We'll begin with a short 10-minute film on Sikhs Serving Humanity. As I have gotten to know many of you through our interfaith work together, if there's one thing I have learned truly distinguishes the Sikh community, it is the deeply held commitment to feeding people regardless of religion, nation of origin, or ethnicity, anyone who may be experiencing food insecurity. In this film, you witness Sikh organizations from all over the world who are doing their part to help alleviate the global issue of hunger caused by the pandemic. The film will be followed by Jasjit Singh in Kisaan, Mazdoor, Ekta, Sikhs and the Art of Protest, and Kirtan Singh, who will speak about the essential intersection of human rights and religion. We conclude with Simran Jeet speaking with Baljinder Kaur, the illustrator of the children's book Fauja Singh Keeps Going, all about celebrating 110 years of Fauja Singh, reflecting on the wisdom of our elders. We are so grateful that you have joined us. We miss seeing you this year, but we know we will one day again in person. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy.
The world is facing an unprecedented pandemic. Unfortunately, food insecurity has emerged as a major byproduct of the crisis across the globe. In the Sikh spirit of selfless service, known as seva, and in the spirit of always working for the good of humanity, a concept we call Sarbat da Pala, Sikhs the world over, no matter which country they call home, have been striving to meet these ideals, especially by feeding hundreds of thousands of those who are in need of food. Feeding those who are hungry, friend or stranger, is the age-old institution known as the langar, which involves volunteers who cook, serve, or deliver food, but at no cost to those in need. No questions asked, no strings attached. In this session, you will hear from 10 Sikh organizations from all over the world who are trying to do their part to help alleviate the global crisis of hunger, particularly its latest manifestation through the ravages wrought by the COVID pandemic.
Vaisakhi ji ka Khalsa, Vaisakhi ji ki Fateh. My name is Tajinder Singh Glamour. I moved to Florida in 1995, and since the inception of this Gurdwara, we have been coming to this Gurdwara from day one.
Vaisakhi ji ka Khalsa, Vaisakhi ji ki Fateh.
My name is Aman Sadana.
Hello everybody, my name is Sanand Singh.
Sashikal ji, my name is Bandana Kaur. Sashikal and hello to everyone. My name is Robin Kaur, and we are speaking to you from California. We are from the Sikh Center, Orange County Food Pantry.
Vaisakhi ji ka Khalsa, Vaisakhi ji ki Fateh. My name is Jasjit Singh. I'm here a volunteer at Khalsa Foundation. Khalsa Foundation is a Sikh Gurdwara based in Pacoima, California. Pacoima is in Los Angeles County, and we've been around for 10 plus years specifically at this location. So thank you for the opportunity of kind of being here and asking these questions about the seva that we're doing.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਦਾਸ ਰਸ਼ਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਢੀਂਡਸਾ founder chairman United Sikh Mission.
Seva is one of the main tradition in the Sikhism, and we believe with this seva you are serving the God, because God lives in anybody, and this is the only way you can have grace of God by serving Him through the humanity and worshipping Him.
My name is Randeep Singh Lal. I am the CEO for an organisation called Nishkam Spot. We're based in London. We are a humanitarian aid organisation, and one of the main projects that we do is looking after the less fortunate. We do street food service, which means we go out to places in the UK and in certain places around the world, and we feed those who would not normally have a hot dinner or breakfast or lunch.
जाकी सेवा नव निध पावे तास्यो मूड़ा मन नहीं लावे. In nutshell, it means is Guru Granth Sahib, our Shabad Guru, gives us the inspiration to do the seva. Goal of our life is to merge with Vaheguru, and that can we do it by doing the seva. And I'm going to quote another line, Awwal Allah Noor Upaya Kudrat ke sab bande. Everybody in this world, everything in this world is made by Vaheguru. And if we respect others, then it means we show respect to Vaheguru. Because it doesn't matter what color, creed, gender they are from, they are made by Vaheguru. And if we show love to them, we are showing love to Vaheguru. This is my inspiration.
Seva for me personally is a means to an end in terms of making myself more humble. There's a line that Manjeev Gail at Khalsa Foundation, who makes a langar, has been involved with us for such a long time, and a very inspiring individual has told us that that Guru Sahib says in Gurbani is Satgur ki seva safal hai je ko kare chitlai man chindya fal pavana home vich ho jaye. And home is really one of the biggest reasons. I feel like I need to get rid of the home. So the more seva we do, the more help we're giving out there, it's just a way to improve ourselves. So it's really to make myself a better person so that I can be a better example for my kids.
The root of my inspiration for starting Seva Truck is one of the basic tenets of Sikhism. It's what Guru Nanak Sahib lived his life with, and it's the institution of langar, sharing a meal with someone who's hungry. Our mission is to help reduce food insecurity. We target at-risk children, primarily in underserved communities, and we partner with schools. For a country like America to still have 12.9 million children in this country not know where their next meal is coming from, we got to fix that.
2005 ਤੋਂ ਲਾ ਕੇ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੈਂਪ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤੇ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀਆਂ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਸਟੇਟਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਾਏ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਨ.
The reason we came together for this food pantry a little bit over 5 months ago is for what the definition of seva is, which is selfless service. So everybody here, and actually all of our 200 volunteers who have come throughout the 5 months, are there for the specific reason of serving people selflessly with no desire for any recognition, because that's not what we're there for. So we're there to do what our gurus had asked of us, and share whatever we can with those in need. And since the pandemic has hit, it has been an even bigger need, especially in the community surrounding the Gurdwara.
हर सतगुर मेलो दया करे जन नानक तो वे पाए.
I would like to thank the Sikh community. It's been a great experience. I enjoy every time that I have to go to work, and it's really fun giving to the community and seeing families coming together to serve and give their time for free. No one in here gets paid for anything that we do. We just know we get up on Friday at 7 in the morning, and we don't know what time we'll be back at our house. And it's really fun. It's not tiring, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. And so anybody, if you know anybody that needs help, look for us.
And absolutely, we look, if we didn't have the vendors, we didn't have support from them. We look forward to, and they look forward to us, and hey, how else we can support you? And we don't look where they are sending, what they're sending, we go and be there with them. And that's how we bring everything together. We're looking forward to come to our center.
Who are you? We're the Sikhs. Who are Sikhs? People don't know who Sikhs are. We just want you to know who we are. We're here to serve you and to protect you.
ਕਿਰਤ ਭੂਮੀ ਤੋਂ ਜੋ ਕਮਾਇਆ ਉਹ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਬਣਿਆ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਲਈ, ਇਸ ਕੌਮ ਲਈ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਸੇਵਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਾਣ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਿਸ ਧਰਤੀ ਤੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਖਾਧਾ ਉਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਕੁਛ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਜੁਮੇ ਤੋਂ ਭਾਰ ਲਾਏ ਹਨ।
ਜਿੱਥੇ ਮੇਰਾ ਸਤ ਗੁਰ ਬੈਠਾ
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome everyone to the Sikhlens virtual Vaisakhi celebration. My name is Kirtan Singh Khalsa. Kirtan Singh means the lion who devotedly sings God's praises. And Khalsa literally means pure, and it takes on the deeper meaning of sovereign, free, sincere, true, straight, and solid. And I'm very grateful to be here today to be speaking with you. I do believe it is something of very high importance and most relevant to all of us who consider ourselves to be Sikhs of the Guru, and hopefully relevant to many others. So the topic today is the essential intersection of human rights and religion. And this is essential because it is of the highest degree of importance that we continue to recognize and understand and appreciate how human rights and religions interact and intersect, and where they come together and where they support one another and where they come into conflict. Over the last few months, I've been involved in a project that has caused me to delve into this topic. And so I'm excited to share some of the things that I've learned. We'll start with a little Sikh history, which to many of you may be familiar, but I do hope that it will bring into context what it is that we're talking about. Prior to Guru Nanak's birth in 1469, in the then Punjab region of India, a spiritual movement had begun referred to as the Bhakti movement. The teachings of this movement were guided in large part by the ideas that rejected the unjust and demoralizing practices associated with the Brahminical casteism and exclusionary aspects of Hinduism. Guru Nanak, from an early age, eschewed these same precepts and what he viewed as the hypocrisies of his own Hindu upbringing. And although Guru Nanak's teachings were in the vein of those who preceded him in the Bhakti movement, unlike them, his life and teachings built the foundations of a revolutionary spiritual way of life that would become the Sikh Dharma of today. Equally relevant, his life inspired a social movement that began a dismantling of centuries-old constructs of socioeconomic inequality, oppression of women, governmental injustice, religious and social oppression. There's a through line in each of the lives and teachings of the Sikh gurus that highlights the oneness of humanity and the oneness of God among all creation. Concurrent with their spiritual teachings were the gurus' living examples of humility, kindness, compassion, courage, and sacrifice. They truly walked the walk. Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, the ninth Nanak, was approached for help by a group of Kashmiri Hindu pundits who were under the threat of death to convert to Islam. He decided to risk his life on their behalf. He pleaded for a peaceful resolution of their case before the tyrannous Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and he was beheaded in return for his effort. He left in his pocket at the time a note that read, "I gave my life, but not my faith." After the beheading of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, in 1675, his son Guru Gobind Singh became Guru at the age of 9 years old. In the 200 years that had transpired from the time Guru Nanak started calling out social injustices, the Sikhs became a distinct religious people. Their parallel principles of faith and social justice consciousness became a threat to both the local ruling Hindu chiefs as well as to the Mughal Empire, whose rule was notorious for the worst sorts of human rights abuses and indignities. And in 1699, Guru Gobind Singh called his Sikhs to join him in Anandpur Sahib for the annual spring gathering of Vaisakhi. Some 70,000 had gathered from far and wide. The Guru came out of his tent that morning, sword drawn, and called for someone to come forward and give their head. He called in a powerful, commanding voice that did not make rational sense with what he was asking for. "This is crazy," many that were assembled rumbled. He continued to call for anyone to step forward to give their head. What was going on? He was testing the dedication of the Sikhs of that time. He wanted to see whether they could live to the examples that had been inscribed by the lives and legacies of all of the gurus into the society of Sikhs. He challenged them to declare themselves as to whether they would deliver on their unspoken promise to live, to serve humanity as their gurus had done. He called them to task on whether they would or could sacrifice their persons and their individual selves for the betterment of humanity and dedicate themselves to fighting the battles against inequality, social oppression, and injustice and religious intolerance and persecution. This was the symbolism that was involved in the stark confrontation and that stark reality in that moment of Guru Gobind Singh's calling to his congregation. And in it, the prospect of death. One by one, 5 individual souls came forward and answered the Guru's call. And sometime afterward, they emerged from his tent radiant, decorated, and adorned as his beloveds, the Panch Pyare, the five beloveds. There's so much to go into about this history, but not enough time. But this Vaisakhi event that we're celebrating marks the identification of Sikhs as Khalsa, that pure, self-initiated, those who are consciousness that transcends the boundaries of caste, gender, race, religion, and other societal divisions and discriminations. They were to champion his ideal, not only for themselves, but for the good of all. That was the mandate of the Khalsa from that day forward. History is replete with spiritual, religious, and faith leaders whose acts of service have liberated humanity from the shackles of oppression and indignity. It may not be an overgeneralization to say that all religions have essential human rights components that contribute toward making their teachings and practices authentic, timeless in their relevance. I'd like to now take this time to put into context human rights from a modern history, global governmental context. The atrocities of the Second World War made the protection of human rights an international priority. An estimated 70 to 85 million persons lost their lives, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. In 1948, the newly formed United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document designed to serve as the global roadmap for freedom and equality. It begins by recognizing that the inherent dignity of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It declares that human rights are universal, to be enjoyed by all people, no matter who they are or where they live. The Universal Declaration includes civil and political rights, like the right to life, liberty, free speech, and privacy. It also includes economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to social security, health, and education. The Declaration outlines 30 rights and freedoms that belong to all of us, and that nobody can or should take away from any human being. As stated in Article 18 of the Declaration, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. The Universal Declaration was the first attempt to set out at a global level the fundamental rights and freedoms shared by all human beings. According to the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commission, quote, freedom of religion or belief has many dimensions, and it intersects with other human rights. The work of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the freedom of religion or belief is guided by the relevant articles pertaining to religion that's contained in the 10 covenants and conventions that comprise the current global human rights treaties. Let's familiarize ourselves a bit with these seminal human rights covenants and conventions. When conventions or covenants are adopted by the UN General Assembly, they create legally binding international obligations for the member states and countries who sign the treaty. When a national government ratifies a treaty, the articles of that treaty become part of its domestic legal obligations. The first of these important treaties is the International Covenant on civil and political rights. This covenant obligates countries who have ratified the treaty to protect and preserve a broad spectrum of basic human rights, such as the right to life and to human dignity, equality before the law, freedom of speech, assembly and association, religious freedom, and privacy, freedom from torture, ill treatment, and arbitrary detention, gender equality, fair trial, and minority rights. This multilateral treaty was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 16, 1966, and has been in force since March 23rd of 1976. The United States signed it in 1977 and ratified it in 1992, and India ratified it in April of 1979, notably even before the United States. The second of these covenants is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This convention commits its members to the elimination of racial discrimination and the promotion of understanding among all races, and also requires its parties to outlaw hate speech and criminalize membership in racist organizations. It was adopted on December 21st, 1965, and entered into force in January of 1969. And as of July 2020, it had 88 signatories with 182 parties who participated in the convention in some form. The United States signed it in 1966 and ratified it in 1994. And India signed it in 1967 and ratified it in 1968. The third of these is the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, and Degrading Treatment of Punishment. The convention requires states to take effective measures to prevent torture in any territory under their jurisdiction, and forbids states to transport people to any country where there's any reason to believe they'll be tortured. This was adopted in December of 1984 and came into force in 1987, signed and ratified by the United States, ratified in 94, and it has not yet been ratified in India, though signed in 1997. The fourth convention on the prevention of punishment of crime of genocide. The Genocide Convention was the first human rights treaty adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December of 1948 and signified the international community's commitment to never again after the atrocities committed during the Second World War. For the sake of time, I'll just list the others. The fifth is the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The sixth is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Seventh being the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The eighth being the Convention on Rights of the Child. The ninth, the International Convention on the Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. The 10th is the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. We can easily see and understand the great significance of these treaties in protecting and preserving these rights that are fundamental to the dignity of all humans and to all of humanity. Ironically, however, religions and religious peoples are some of the biggest and strongest opponents of these rights. Wherever human rights bump up against and contradict or conflict with religious freedom rights, then we have a problem. In many circles of the world, religion and human rights are seen as opposing concepts. For many activists working on women's rights, LGBT concerns, for example, organized faith communities and their leaders are invariably a big part of the problem and only rarely, if ever, part of the solution. This view, though valid, vastly underestimates existing and potential points of collaboration between human rights and religious organizations. So where and how do these conflicts exist or arise? We'll just point out a few, and the one most recent and most relevant, of course, is COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic had caused countries to impose temporary quarantine and isolation restrictions, which have in turn had a dramatic impact on human rights, including freedom of religious rights. These restrictions conflict with the right to assemble. The World Health Organization in April of 2020 issued a set of guidelines and recommendations that emphasizes the importance of religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and faith communities in responding to COVID-19. Governments should engage civil society, religious leaders, and faith communities in practical steps that result in the delivery of care and protections in trying times. Although, for example, that isn't always to be relied upon. In Iran, the government released prisoners to prevent the spread of the virus, but placed some of the imprisoned Sufi religious community in overcrowded wards. In India, as we witnessed, the Hindu majority state targeted the Muslim minority population, blaming them for the rise in cases of COVID-19. In Georgia, authorities allowed religious gatherings for Orthodox Christians during Easter, but reacted with hostility when Muslims wanted to gather for Ramadan. In some parts of the United States, pastors continued to organize religious services during the pandemic, calling themselves essential services. When influential local religious leaders support measures that could curb the virus, it can make a difference. In some cases, religious gatherings have proven to be hotbeds for outbreaks. For example, half of South Korea's cases can be tracked back to a meeting of the Shinjoji Church of Jesus. In Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur, several hundred Muslims who attended a mosque service contracted the virus. And in Washington, D.C., a rector tested positive for the virus after performing communion at an Episcopal church with more than 500 congregants, all of whom were asked afterward to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. Another intersection where human rights and religious freedom conflict is the area of women's rights. Many religious groups have been avid opponents of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. In fact, the United States is one of the only nations to have not signed this covenant. India's current farmers' protest is an example of how religion, politics, and human rights intersect. Per Human Rights Watch, the government in India's Prime Minister Modi is providing over a dangerous regression in free speech rights in pursuit of its Hindu nationalist agenda. Now, farmers, many of them Sikhs, who have been peacefully protesting since November, are facing criticism for opposing controversial new farm laws. Authorities have made baseless claims against Sikh and other activists of incitement. We must ask ourselves, what role does religion play in relationship to the political circumstances playing out there between a Hindu majority government and a Sikh minority protest of farmers? Treating freedom of religion and beliefs as the first and foremost right, though, of human rights is potentially as damaging as overlooking freedom of religion entirely. Human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, and very often so are violations of human rights. Lack of attention to freedom of religion can lead to protection gaps, but an overemphasis on freedom of religion can lead to other relevant rights being overlooked. Discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief rarely concerns only restrictions of religious practices and manifestations, but also involves violations of various other rights. And a freedom of religion perspective is not necessarily the sole or most relevant perspective through which to view them. Neither approach, one or the other, adequately reflects the complex realities on the ground religious leaders and faith communities are facing in these times. Religious leaders and faith communities are the largest and best organized civil institutions in the world, claiming the allegiance of billions of believers and bridging the divides of race, class, nationality. More than any other civil society, these leaders have the experience of establishing and working with international partnerships. Their expertise can greatly benefit the global efforts of human rights wherever they are found. Ironically, but not coincidentally, Amnesty International has disassociated itself with religious participation because religious communities and organizations are often and too often seen as being in conflict with human rights. Buddhist monks and nuns, imams, pastors, priests, leaders of other faith communities, of course, grantees, all play a powerful role in shaping attitudes, opinions, and behaviors because we are representative of our communities, and these leaders are trusted, the most trusted members of those communities. This is why we as Sikhs have a duty and responsibility to recognize that as a global faith community, we have an essential role to play in promoting human rights. Many Sikh institutions are examples of service to humanity through their free kitchens and preparing and serving langar where it is needed, and many other service outreaches in various places wherever Sikhs reside. We've seen a great charity kala spirit of Sikhs, boundless spirit around the globe rising to the occasion during this time of COVID, and the example of the free kitchens that have sprung up and have been increased, their services increased during this time. May we all, people of all religions, all communities, sincerely examine how human rights intersect with religious freedoms and how they both combine and collide. May all religious peoples consider ways that we can advance and excel and recognize and understand that we reside ourselves at the essential intersection of human rights and religion, and that is imperative upon us individually and collectively to enter into the crucial conversations that require us to introspect and consider who we are and what the original essence of our community's foundations mean in the context of our living religions, and how we can bridge the gap between potential contradictions of understandings between those beliefs and the essential principles of human rights, which I believe is never contradictory in any spiritual or religious context. So thank you for your time. And I thank Sikhlens and all of its organizers for making this film possible and inspiring us to pause and consider our unique roles in creating a better tomorrow. May God bless us all. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Kamaljit Kaur. I'm the Director of Development for Jagata Movement and a resident of Fresno, California, our wonderful Central Valley. Today, I have a great pleasure of interviewing Jasjit Singh. He is the Director of Programs at California Change Lawyers, which is a statewide foundation that diversifies the legal field and help build the next generation of change makers. He's also worked with various Sikh organizations and currently is serving as a board member of the Jagata Movement. Thank you for being here with us, Jasjit Singh.
Thank you, Kamal, and thank you to Sikhlens for putting this together.
So today we're going to be talking about the farmers' protests, the bills, a little bit of history. So my first question to you is, what are the farmers in India currently protesting?
So, the farmers are protesting these 3 farm bills, and I think many folks at this point have become very aware of the details of the farm bills. I think it's a simple way to put it is that these farm bills were passed in a very undemocratic format, taking advantage of current times, as you know, with the COVID crisis, and kind of pushing these bills through Parliament without any true conversation or discussion with union leadership, with people who are actually farmers. And instead, as folks have talked about this, have instead just relied on what corporations are looking for and trying to create farm bills that benefit large corporations rather than actually benefiting farmers. So farmers are protesting that, and that's where we're at.
So what do you think is Sikhi's role in these protests?
So I think Sikhi plays a huge role in these protests. And, for me, it goes back to the inception of Sikhi, that revolutionary viewpoint from Guru Nanak Dev Ji that reshaped not just the Indian subcontinent and the surrounding regions, but so much of what is now Punjab and the surrounding area of northern India, for example. So much of that was historically Punjab. So when we think about the fact that other states have joined this protest, states that include Himachal, Haryana, these are states who have been witness to the revolution that Sikhi has brought, as these states were originally part of Punjab itself. And if we think about the ties to the farming and to the Sikh community, we have to remember that looking back at Banda Singh Bahadur, who, for example, was the first to create a sovereign Sikh state in this region, Banda Singh Bahadur is the one who actually came through and got rid of the Zamindar system, actually was able to free folks who were working the land, the peasants, and actually said that if you work the land, that you now will own the land and you will reap the benefits of tilling that land. So I think so much of the history is tied to Sikhi's role in bringing about revolution, bringing about social freedom, and bringing about justice to the community and much of South Asia in general. I think another piece is that the Sikh community makes up the majority of the state of Punjab in its current form in India. So much of the labor force that Punjabi farmers receive come from Bihar, which is a state, a neighboring state, and Bihar has already felt the brunt of similarly worded farm ordinances that have been implemented and in fact have decimated their own farming community. They come to Punjab. These are farmers back in Bihar who are coming to Punjab and acting as laborers because it's actually more financially beneficial for them to become a laborer and work in Punjab rather to grow crops in Bihar. And I think Punjab was able to see through the language of these bills and saw what type of impact it would have on their state and on their agricultural community. And they began these protests months and months before these protests made it to their current state outside, on the outskirts of Delhi. We have to remember that this is truly a people's movement. People began protesting from the early onset in the state of Punjab. They're fighting back, to be honest. They're fighting to go back to a system that's already broken, right? When we talk about what these corporations are looking for, they're getting silos to hoard crop. There's infrastructure that's being built by these large corporations. There's subsidies that are being provided to these large corporations. These are all things that if farmers were being provided with such infrastructure, subsidies, and financial incentives, they too would be part of this process, but they're not. Instead, we're looking at a system where Sikhs who rely heavily on their independent spirit are being asked to become essentially corporate farmers rather than having the ability to farm their crops in the structure that they want to. So I think an important piece also is that when we talk about the people's movement, it's about the people's energy that's so cohesive throughout the state and then inspired other states to do the same. So the the movement that started in Punjab is inspired through Sikhi. That's the movement that broke through those barricades in the first place and started making its way down towards the outskirts of Delhi. I think it's notable to say that many of the union leaders were not necessarily in favor of that, but when they saw that people were going to push through and go to Delhi anyways, they decided to join. And I think that's a good sign of leadership in that perspective. And I think, and I'll mention that when we're thinking about what is Sikhi's role in these protests in its current format, we have to look at what are Sikhs doing at the protest sites. So as you've noticed, we have langar, so we have food, we have healthcare, we have various organizations providing healthcare, free healthcare, education. There's schools, there's been tents with libraries set up, and then housing. If you look at some of the work that Khalsa Aid has done, for example, there's tents and blankets and pillows and so much more that people are being provided with so that they can try to make this protest bearable. And if you think about it, these are all things that the government promises in the first place: food, healthcare, education, housing, but they rarely are able to follow through on that. If you think about where these protesters are sitting, they're sitting on the outskirts of Delhi, near slums, and actually kids from those slums are coming through and getting education for the first time. They're getting healthy food. They're getting health checkups. So I think it just goes to show how Sikhs have a history of showing up when they need to show up. And these institutions are so deeply rooted in our community that we can persevere like this for months if we need to.
That's a really great point about, how this protest definitely has taken inspiration from Sikhi. So going off of that, what is the Sikh history of protests?
So I think the modern form of protests where we see folks marching, and doing these things, maybe that's not something that we've always seen throughout history. If we look back at our own Sikh history, I think our form of protest truly did start with Guru Nanak Dev Ji, right? If we think about speaking up in the face of injustice, that's something Guru Nanak Dev Ji first did when it comes to the Mughal emperors and it comes to speaking out against injustices being taken out on other communities. That is a protest, right? Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji showing up for the Kashmiri Pandits, although not a Hindu himself, although not directly involved with the concerns of the community, realizing that by placing protests and speaking up for another community, he himself was killed for exercising that level of protest in Chandni Chowk in Delhi, right? Just a few miles away from this protest site. Another example, if we think about Guru Gobind Singh Ji and we think about the Zafarnama, we think about that response that he wrote itself is a protest. It's in and of itself is a writing that talks about the lies and deceptions committed by the Mughal Empire and Aurangzeb and the Hindu hill chiefs who betrayed and lied on their promises and moved back on their promises. So he talks about that, and he himself solidifies his form of protest, of speaking up and fighting back against these injustices. And then moving past the Guru's times, we think about Sikhs during the British Empire's rule, right? Once Punjab was annexed, how did Sikhs continue to protest? Well, Sikhs oftentimes, and these statistics are always given to us about Sikhs, were the ones who courted the most arrests, executed and exiled. And that's true, right? Sikhs spoke up. And we have seen through our own history, when we think about the Bhagat Singhs, when we think about the Kartar Singh Sarabas and Udham Singhs, these are folks who were jailed, executed, and so many other Sikhs were exiled for protesting against the British Empire. And a famous, I'd say, if we think about the traditional form of protest, if we think about the Punjab Sahib massacre, where a lot of folks might not know about this, but I think it was in 1922, there was a train that was headed, it was a train of Sikh political prisoners that was headed through the Punjab Sahib region, and Sikhs decided that they wanted to stop the train and feed all all the prisoners langar, and the train, I guess, was on strict orders not to stop, and Sikhs actually laid down in the tracks and were run over. The train eventually did come to a stop, and one of the main leaders of that protest, while he was mauled by this train, told the folks who were there with him that this is the opportunity to serve langar and give it to all the folks who were on that train, and they did. So, and we keep going through that. We think about the Akali movement. We think about how Sikhs have courted arrests and protested even once the British left and the India was created in 1947, and how Sikhs continued to protest, whether it was for language, linguistic rights, land rights, water rights, courting arrest, protesting. This is something that all of us have grown up with. So I think Sikh history is filled with examples of protest, and I think that's why it's, in an odd sense, it's so easy for our people to just go out there and get on the streets and say, yeah, this isn't okay. We're going to speak up for ourselves, but we're also going to speak up for others because we have a history of doing that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So my next question is, in these protests, we've seen who have been the leaders or the ones with the mics, but we are now able to, as time has gone on, seen the voices of marginalized folks and women. So what has been the role of women in this protest?
Unfortunately, I think women have had to once again pave their own path. Although they've organically risen to the top, they haven't been given the mic per se. If we think about the union leadership, none of the union leaders are women, yet women are going to extraordinary measures and speaking up at the risk of their own lives in order to join in solidarity of these protests and actively participate. So I think it's important to remember that women are farmers. Women are farming. They're also bearing the brunt of the farming woes that continue to plague the region, right? When we think about specifically Punjab, we think about Punjab's woes with farmer suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, all things that are falling on the shoulders of these women, and also the enduring the debt that's left behind by their husbands or their sons when they have taken their lives or otherwise no longer able to do the work because they're drowning in alcohol and drugs. The debts don't go away, and these women are having to take on roles that are historically not theirs. I think it's also important to note that our elderly women Buzurg are playing a huge role in this movement. Many of them have endured so much, whether that's 1947, that's 1984, the whole 80s and 90s through state-sponsored genocide. We have to remember that these women have seen so much, have lost so much, and yet they're here too. And they continue to endure. I think that's inspirational in and of itself. And I think a really good example, I'd say, is the rise of Nodeep Kaur, right? And some of you folks may know that Nodeep is a Sikh activist who comes from a Dalit background, who has become the face of female resistance. If we think about combining her Dalit background with her being at the protest site, it paints an important picture of like this, Kisaan, Mazdoor, Ekta, Zindabad Nara, like what does that really mean? If we think about it, landless communities rely heavily on farming communities for their own livelihoods. And this protest is bringing together communities who have otherwise been at ends with one another due to issues around caste privilege. And if you think about it, 35% of Punjab comes from a Dalit background, and they own less than 5% of that land. And oftentimes Dalit women are especially important in this space because they're oftentimes working side by side with their male counterparts in the fields as laborers. So I think it's not even just the role of women, it's the powerful role of Dalit women who continue to speak up in the face of so much uncertainty when it comes to police brutality and state-sponsored violence. If we think about Nodeep Kaur, she was sexually assaulted by the police. It's important to note that these are things that the police feel like they're able to do because they see someone from a quote unquote lower caste as somebody that they can do whatever they want to. That's why it's so easy for her to be taken in and treated the way that she was treated, because there is this deep, deep, deep rooted caste issue and caste privilege problem across that country. I'll also add that if we think about women putting their lives at risk by protesting, we think about the general response from the worldwide community, like the global community. We think about how Rupi Kaur inspired so many people. She herself has spoken up, but she also inspired the likes of, for example, Rihanna or Greta Thunberg or Mina Harris, who, as we know, is the current United States Vice President Kamala Harris's niece. She inspired all these folks to speak up. But what's really worrisome is that even though these women spoke up, the Indian nationalists, especially from the BJP party, men, decided to burn effigies, threatened to kill, threatened to rape these women, burn their photos. But never once did they burn photos or create any such sort of threats against the males around the world who had spoken up. So one example is Kyle Kuzma, a popular NBA basketball player for the Lakers. No one was burning his photos. No one was doing anything like that. So I think it really goes to show how much our women are bearing the brunt of what's going on. And in many ways, it's unrecognized. And there's really no way to thank. It's like an endless thanks to our women who continue to put their lives at risk facing all these injustices.
And my last question to you today is, what has been the role of the diaspora in these protests?
The diaspora has been so powerful. I think so much of our communities live outside of India, and we have built these amazing communities, and there are cities where, especially in general South Asians, but especially the Sikh community continues to thrive in, right? Popularly, you're in Fresno, large Sikh population. We think about California in general has over 500,000 Sikhs, but also around the UK and in Canada and Australia. Something that comes to mind is back in December of 2020, Jakarta movement put together a car rally that was attended by well over, in my estimate, I know it says 10,000, but I'm sure it's well over 15, maybe 20,000 people. And it was so inspiring to be amongst that community and just rallying and going from Oakland, California, across the Bay Bridge to the SF Indian Consulate's office and protesting there. I think it's a sign of strength, it's a sign of unity, and it's a sign that we are well aware of what's going on. And we're speaking up not just for the Sikh community, but for anyone in India and around the world who is being marginalized and otherwise oppressed, not just by these farm bills, but in general. Specific to our community, this movement has, in my opinion, reignited young Sikhs to learn more about their community, to deepen their ties to their own community, deepen their ties to their homeland, and think beyond just like the romanticized version of going back home, but also thinking about how do you actually give back? How do we fix infrastructure? How do we create a better tomorrow for our community? But also even here, locally or in the countries that we now live in, I think it's inspiring young folks to possibly run for office, to find leadership positions at nonprofits and other organizations that can continue to inspire and create a generation of leadership that will not stay silent. I think we have examples of many community leaders and government elected officials who have remained silent. And I think this next generation understands that that's not enough for them. They need folks that either speak up for them or they will speak up for themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Today, I guess we would like to thank Sikhlens for allowing us this space to talk about, farmers' protest and what's going on with the Sikh community at this moment, which is so integral to, all of our lives. So yeah, thank you for allowing us this space to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Kamal. Also, yes, thank you to Sikhlens, and we encourage you to continue to learn more about the protest and visit Jakarta Movement's website, thingsjakarta.org, to learn more about what Jakarta is doing for the community and inspiring our next generation of young folks to take these leadership positions. So that's it.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Simran Singh, and I'm the author of Fauja Singh Keeps Going, the true story of the oldest person to ever run a marathon.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh, and I'm the illustrator of the book Fauja Singh Keeps Going.
Welcome to the Sikhlens virtual Vaisakhi celebration. Baljinder and I are really happy to be with you all. We have loved working on this book, Fauja Singh Keeps Going. It's been a real treat, and I would say, I'll let you speak for yourself, but for me, it's been a dream come true. So it's just been such a cool journey and experience, especially because it's honoring someone who means a lot to me personally, and I think for you too, Baljinder. And so we just are going to have a conversation about one of the aspects of the story in Fauja Singh's life that feels interesting and important to us. And we welcome you to listen in as we talk about it. So the theme that we want to explore today is the idea of our elderly, our elders, as we call them in Punjabi, or Buzurgs, which derives from Persian, meaning the great ones. And in our culture and in our tradition, we really have a lot of respect for the elderly in a way that I haven't really seen in the American context. I'd be interested to know if it's, if that's what you see in the UK context too, Baljinder. But I guess I would want to start and just ask you that question. What does it look like in the UK as a general cultural perspective on the elderly, as opposed to how we think about our elders in Punjabi contexts?
I think you're right. I think it's quite similar to how you're describing what the American culture might be like. I think it feels a lot more integrated when it's within the Punjabi community. It just feels like it's a more wholesome approach. Yeah, I think it's quite similar. Maybe it's just the kind of Western diaspora type of experience.
Yeah, I mean, one of the strange things for me growing up, we had our we grew up in Texas, and my dadki and my nanki lived in Punjab still, but they would visit often. And as they got older, I mean, there was no concept of a nursing home. And all of my friends in school, their grandparents lived in nursing homes. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them. And that concept seemed so foreign to me. Like there was no way that my parents would ever want to do that, want to live separate from I mean, they really found value in taking care of their own parents, like their parents had cared for them. So yeah, that's something that stuck out to me growing up.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's really interesting sometimes, because sometimes I'm amongst my peers, and even just mentioning that I live with my mother-in-law, and for me that's really normal. It's quite normalized, but for them it's a really alien concept. Like, so you live with his mum, but it's like, yeah, it's it's just the way families work with us. But
yeah, I guess that's been one of the most exciting things for me about working on Fauja Singh's story. I think there is this perception that when you get to a certain age, you lose value in our society. And the term we use for that is ageism. We have a stereotype of elderly people that they don't really have anything to offer us. And I think it's been really fun to show kids and people all around the world that our elders can be our heroes, just like Fauja Singh, and to show one of the most inspiring things that I honestly didn't even think about in writing this book is I've heard so many people say my grandparents or my elderly parents have read this story and feel inspired by Fauja Singh, that it's like he started his life over in his 80s. He immigrated to a new country. He started running. He really learned to take care of himself in a new way. And so, yeah, that's been really something special for me. I don't know if that's something you've heard or that you felt through Fauja Singh's story as well.
Definitely. I actually remember someone had shared something in their Insta story saying how I think it was a grandchild reading it with their grandparent, their nanaji or their dadaji, but they were saying how the grandparent couldn't understand Punjabi, but because they were reading through the story and they had the pictures and images and stuff, it was working together, they could understand it too and, kind of follow the narrative. But an interesting thing is my dad, for example, he's, I think for the past decade, he's been saying, I'm too old now, I can't do anything. And he stopped riding his bike and he stopped doing things like that. But I remember when he read the story, Fauja Singh's story, and he learned about the age, he's like, he sensed a new kind of inspiration and motivation, and he started riding his bike, started going on the treadmill. It's amazing. It does have an effect.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, I anticipated there would be some, because I felt it personally, that when I first learned of Fauja Singh and his running, he was in his 90s then when I first heard of him. And it moved me I was in my 20s. And so of course there is this mind-blowing aspect to it that says, oh, you know what, I make these excuses for myself, but he's not making excuses. And actually there's this double movement of you yourself feel inspired, but also it shatters your stereotype that, and I'll admit to it now, yes, of course, I've grown up in this Punjabi context where I've learned to respect my elders and see them as the transmitters of wisdom as we think of them in our tradition.
Yeah.
But I definitely have this bias within me as well, which is ageist and sees more value in people who are younger. And so I don't think I would have noticed that really without my interactions through Fauja Singh, which, when your stereotypes are shattered, you have no option but to look within yourself and be like, oh, why did I think that? I didn't even know that I thought about elderly people.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of our culture is around the consumer culture is around something gets old or something gets kind of battered in some way, you kind of just dispose of it or you move on. But I think I'm even just thinking about in our culture, in the way we repair things, like my mum would repair a suit or something like that, stitch it up together. There would be care and conservation and that idea of preserving something rather than just move on. And I think that's a part of that maybe kind of falls into why we might stereotype age and
it's I don't want to stick on this for too long, but one of the things you're bringing up for me is this past year when the pandemic hit, and I live in New York City, so it was here in the States the first real site of pain for this country. I was shocked by the conversations that people were having publicly about, it only affects the elderly. It's okay to let them die off. And again, it takes me back to this nursing home concept, which is like, oh my God, how can you talk about any other human being like that, especially our elders? So anyway, I think you're saying something really interesting for me around this consumerist culture where we always want newness. We want the latest version of the iPhone, or we want a new car or whatever, right? We always want the new thing. And so what does that mean about those things that are older? It's a great point. One of the things I want to say is I was actually following your work for a long time before you joined as the illustrator for this book. And one of the things that attracted me to your work is that you had always depicted the elderly. There were many things that made me feel like you would be the perfect illustrator for this book, in addition to your artistic skill, right? You have the Punjabi Sikh background, you live in the UK, like Fauja Singh, so you could depict those two different worlds of his life. But also you had this affinity for depicting the elderly in your art, and I loved that. And I think I loved it because hadn't really seen it anywhere before, and I haven't really seen it anywhere since. So I'd be interested to know how you got into that. What drew you to start drawing? Nice. Drew you to start drawing the elderly. Where did that come from?
I'm not quite sure myself, other than just the idea of observational drawing, just looking around. And I think as artists and illustrators, we're always encouraged to just notice things around you and just really pay attention. And I don't know, I think I've just naturally been drawn to that. I think there's something really beautiful and wonderful. And a lot of the time they feel like they're the invisible generation that goes unnoticed. But there's, I don't know, it's, you kind of, you see how extraordinary the ordinary kind of ness of seeing them is, if that makes sense. And also I've always lived in places where there has been a population of elderly Sikh Punjabi kind of communities. I was originally from Leicester, and Wolverhampton has the second biggest one to Southall. So I think always seeing them around and just noticing them, it's just, I think I just happened to be in the right place. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and if you follow Baljinder on Instagram, you'll see that these depictions are not new to her. I mean, she doesn't just do this for the Fauja Singh book. This is something that she does consistently, depicting the elderly, and especially in art. I mean, do you have any samples? I see some art in the room behind you.
Yeah, I do. It's from a book that I'm currently working on, but I've got this because this I've had this stuck up on my wall because this is one of the earlier elderly friends that I made when I went to Paris on my Erasmus year. So I went to an art school there for a year, and I made a friend who lived above me. And he was great because he'd always have this jardak up and he'd always sit like this, but I just drew him to remember him. Yeah, it was a good way of just to document and archive him. I'm not sure how he's doing now or if he's still around, but it's nice that a part of him has stayed with me. So
yeah,
it's nice. Yeah.
I could also share, while we're looking at some of your art, I could share some of the images from the book that show Fauja Singh in his elderly age. And one of the things I'd love to talk us through is if you could tell us a little bit about your process. Like, how do you as an illustrator come to, especially in a story that's a biography, and you want to capture Fauja Singh's true character, not just how he looks, but how he emotes, how he feels. There's, even in this illustration, there's a lot of emotion. How do you capture this?
Oh, I think it's really tricky, but a lot of it is drawing upon my own experiences and trying to empathize. But also, one of the first things we did was to interview Fauja Singh and meet him, because I'd never met him before. And that really helped, because I think, it's really different when you see him like on the kind of news or YouTube videos or things like that. But when you meet him in person, there's a whole different energy, and just being around that, it's really nice to experience that. And that becomes kind of collected in my little visual library, as in it's there, part of it. But because, as you were saying, like drawing upon experiences that we have that are similar, for instance, being from a Punjabi Sikh background, and kind of merging and collating them together. So, for instance, the little lizard on the wall, I think that lizards, the kiddly on the wall, that's like a common experience that most of us would probably see when going to Punjab, right? Or the little diva that you'd see there. So it's that collective kind of memory that you have as a community that you can kind of try and tap into, and that helps a lot, I think.
Yeah.
Because as an individual, I can't get into his mind, but I have access to the community mind. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And actually, the lizard in particular, I just did an event with the Asia Society this past week, and some of the people in the room were like, "Oh my God, no illustrator has actually captured my daily life growing up better than this one." So yeah, those touches are really nice. I'll show a few more. Can I ask you about your choice of his clothing? Because I see these and they're so on point. And I feel, one of the things I say to people when they ask about the illustrations in this book is that I can't think of anyone outside of you, and maybe that's because of the bias, because we've worked together now, but I can't imagine someone who's not Punjabi or Sikh and doesn't have a feel for what that's like, would actually depict any of the details. I mean, the lizard is an example, but the clothes throughout the book really stick out to me. They seem like exactly what a Buzurg in our community would wear. So can you tell us about how you do that?
I think it comes from all the observing, because I'm constantly watching and observing the community, and I'm a part of it. I think it's as simple as that. Even the little, if you go back to the other one, there's the little Nishan Sahib on the dechi. I don't know if that's ever been a family thing in like a part of your family like tradition, but it's always been something in my mum would think that if she ties like a little piece of the Nishan Sahib, not only obviously you'll always know it's your deji, but she had this thing that it'll never get lost. it's like a lucky thing. But drawing upon that really helps. Yeah, I think it is a lot of it just being part of the community. It just becomes natural, and I think that's why it's really important to have those kind of own voices, because you can pick up on those nuances because they're just so inherent to the way you exist and the way you are. So it's second nature. You don't really think about it too much. It just is.
Yeah. You know, while we're on this page, one of the things the book has been out for 4 months or so now, maybe 5. And I've seen the illustrations maybe a year before it came out because it took about a year to print. And I felt like I had seen it all. And last week I noticed for the first time the illustrations that he's looking at in the photo book. You have Easter eggs all throughout the book, but this one I didn't. So if I'm seeing it right, and I've been trying to look pretty closely, the first 2 on what would be his left are illustrations from earlier in the book. And on the right, that's a photo of his family, a real photo.
Yeah, it's a real photograph. That's the only photograph I could find. But yeah, that's his actual family. So that was nice to have in there. That was really nice to have in there.
Okay, so tell me, I know you're saying like it feels really natural and you don't overthink it, which I think makes sense when you're depicting your own community. But what about these kinds of? I guess the question for me is: are these like little secrets that you do for yourself for fun? Or I can pull up a few other examples. Let's see. Or maybe it's better. Yeah, it's probably better for me to point them out than for you because then you might give away your secrets. But I know on the TV that looks like a real picture to me.
Yeah, that's a real picture of an actual marathon that he's watching. Yeah, this room was really special because again, this is drawn upon my own childhood home. From the 90s when we lived in a terrace, and again the money plant, that's a common thing that was, I don't know if that's a thing that was in America, but in the UK everybody had a money plant, and it would overgrow on the whole like living room, more so kind of South Asian migrant homes, and the rugs was a thing. Yeah, I think it just feels like I think when you're illustrating a story like this, it feels like it's your story just as much as it's his story. It becomes a part of you. And so you draw upon everything about yourself. It always comes through.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about storytelling, because I feel that too. It's such a strange thing because you would think that a biography is just the straight information about someone's life. But a biography is written by somebody, and whoever's writing it, and I've realized this through writing my own biography now of Fauja Singh, whoever's writing it is filtering through their own perspectives what feels most important, right? I don't talk about every detail of his life. We skip over his middle age for the most part, and that's because to me, the beginning of his life and the later part of his life are what have been most meaningful to me personally. And so there are real choices. There's a lot of myself in this story, not in terms of my own biography, but just in terms of what values feel most salient. I'm a big runner myself now because of Fauja Singh, and there's a lot of attention to the detail around how we talk about running and marathons. Another writer who doesn't care about running probably wouldn't care so much about that. So that's a really interesting point about it being a sort of blend between Fauja Singh's life and your illustrations and your own life.
I think it's also that, I remember hearing a quote saying, there are thousands of truths out there, but what's your truth? And it kind of becomes like that, because it's, even though it's his story, this story could be told in as many ways as there are people, because that's how many, ways there are to perceive it or filter it through. And so I think it's unique to everybody in that way, isn't it? It's just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, in Bani, we talk about that sort of thing all the time, or
yeah.
The gurus talk about this sort of thing all the time, where they talk about all the diversity we see within this world is truly diverse. Like that difference is real, but also it derives from a single source. And I find that to be so powerful, because so many people in this world are struggling with this idea of difference. Like, how do I deal with someone who, like, are they better than me? Are they worse than me? Do I treat them well? Do I not? Yeah. And we in our tradition don't really have that problem. And if we can understand that, like, there's real value for our lives. But also, if we can understand that in relation to storytelling and recognize what you're saying, I think that's so powerful, that there are, in every story, there are countless perspectives. And I think there's something really cool about the way that works with the way that our gurus thought about the world and the way they talked about life. So
yeah, I think storytelling is probably one of the most powerful ways to connect to other people, and I think if that's what we're here to do, to connect deeper to ourselves and to other people, then it's a really great tool. And I remember another quote from a poet who said that the world is made up of stories and not atoms. The stories is what really makes us, rather than all of the kind of the I don't know, the logical way we might kind of construct things in our head. It's actually stories and magic and life and all of these things. So
there is, I agree with you 100%. Like, storytelling is the way you connect with people. And part of the way I've learned that is, I'm a scholar of history and religion. If I was to write a list of facts about Fauja Singh's life and age, I mean, people might be interested to see that and say, oh, cool, like, very interesting. But it's not going to stick with anyone in the same way. And I think the real point for me is you're not going to be able to challenge your assumptions and really empathize with someone who's different from you in the same way. And so, excuse me, and that, to me, that's part of the value of this book. For young Sikhs, it's about seeing someone from within their community who is a hero. Like, that to me is the most important thing. But there's also something interesting about things like Fauja Singh is older and teaching our kids that their elders can be heroes. And then the flip side is for kids outside of our community, like, those things are true, and also their assumptions about people in our community may not be true. And there's a way that they can humanize them and connect them and that sort of thing. So I agree with you absolutely. I guess my question is, just purely out of my own interest, like, you've devoted your career now to storytelling, and specifically for children. And I would love to know why kids. Like, why is it that, of all the different ways that you could tell stories, what draws you towards children's picture books and storytelling?
Oh, that's a big question. I think the best way I can put it is, first and foremost, I think children's picture books always feel as if they save me on a very personal level. I think when I felt quite hopeless sometimes about things, and you kind of find yourself on the darkest days, and I picked up a picture book, it always fills me with lots of hope, and hope's a huge thing for me, and it just sparks me up right back into life. Other than that, I think picture books, in so many ways, they are one of the kind of first kind of window points and teachers for children. One of the first things that you're going to see, not just in terms of the arts, as in it's almost like a gallery of kind of, like an access to a gallery that they can kind of go in and out of. But it's one of the first seeds that are planted, I guess. I see it as that, and also with the picture book dynamic, with the children's book dynamic. I mean, everything is so kind of digital and screen based. This is one of the rare things that you can have, where you can have an actual kind of feeling experience, and you can sit again with intergenerations. You have that experience where you can sit with a child or a guardian or whatever, and really experience and connect to another world, and have a window or a mirror into another world. There's so many things about it. I don't think I could put it all into one answer, other than I just think they're absolute magic, and they're kind of I see them as magical portals into other worlds. And I think that's what draws me to them so much.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I understand that you've thought about this a lot more than you can probably articulate in the 2-minute answer. But your response is so helpful to me. I mean, I see something really similar. Having young daughters of my own, I think about it a lot. That these what we expose them to, and it can be books and shows and movies and whatever, right? Like whatever they're exposed to, it's going to shape them, right? It works very similar to the way that we talk about Sangat in our tradition. You become who you spend time with and what you spend time with, and you use the analogy of seeds, and that made me think of this line from Vaisakhi var Bijay bek mangyang amrit vekho eonel. If you plant poison and you expect amrit, like how fair is that? Like how ridiculous is that? It makes no sense. And so I think my wife and I have become very particular about what we expose our kids to, not because we feel like we know what we're doing as parents, but because I think it's really true that we as human beings, we really do, in the way that you're saying, that there is some magic to this, but like we can kind of trace the magic and say, this is how transformation works. Like you follow a particular logic and you end up in this way. So that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, as planting seeds. I like that.
Yeah, I think the thing you said about transformation as well, I think books are, like you said, other types of media and culture as well, but books in particular, I always feel like there's something really transformative about them. Not only can you take them at your own pace, when you're watching something else, you just take it as you go, but you've got this kind of control over the page turns and how you take your time and how you digest something. It's a very tangible experience. It's very kind of in the physical world. But the idea of there's this idea of just reading radiantly, the way you kind of have a conversation with the book as well. It's really different. It's unique, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I think the more we talk about how much we love books, the more people will realize that we're just a pair of nerds talking about how much we like being nerds. So
I don't read enough books. I just read picture books. Really, I can't say I'm a nerd.
Well, I thank you for just hanging out with me and talking about life and our elders and books and all that stuff. Again, this is Baljinder Kaur, the illustrator of Fauja Singh Keeps Going. She's amazing. She has new books coming out and other books already out, so look her up and buy her books. And we can expect that in the fall. Kamal's case?
Yeah, in the fall.
Awesome.
Kamal's case, yeah.
All right, we'll look forward to that. And my name is Simran. Thank you all for hanging out with us too. And we look forward to seeing another time. Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa. Vaiguru.